March 7, 1945. The town of Remagen sits quiet beneath a gray morning sky, the Rhine sliding past its banks like something ancient and unbothered by the war tearing the continent apart. On a ridge above the river, a young American lieutenant named Karl Timmermann raises his binoculars and cannot quite believe what he is looking at. The Ludendorff railway bridge, a black iron lattice slung across Germany's last great natural barrier, is still standing. Wired with demolition charges, guarded by nervous engineers, but standing. Somewhere behind him, further back along the roads of the Rhineland, the intelligence that put him on this ridge at this precise moment has already been traveling for days, passed hand to hand through a chain of men who never fired a shot near this bridge but who made its capture possible. Reconnaissance pilots banking their unarmed aircraft through flak-streaked skies. Photo interpreters hunched over light tables in freezing farmhouses. Armored cavalry scouts creeping along hedgerows in jeeps with no armor worth the name. This is a story about them, about the unglamorous, unrelenting work of finding out what the enemy is doing before he does it, and about how that work redrew the entire campaign for the Rhine. It rarely gets the credit of the men who stormed the bridge or crossed the river under fire. But without it, there would have been no bridge to storm, and the war in the West might have ground on for months longer than it did. By early 1945, the Rhine had become the last psychological and physical wall standing between the Allied armies and the industrial heart of Germany. Every American commander from Eisenhower downward understood that whoever crossed it first, and with the fewest casualties, would shape the final months of the war. The trouble was that nobody actually knew, with any real confidence, what waited on the far bank. German engineers had spent months preparing demolition charges on every bridge along a river that stretched for hundreds of kilometers, and Allied planners had to assume that by the time infantry reached any crossing point, the bridge there would already be rubble in the water. The alternative, an opposed river crossing under fire, was not an abstract fear. Planners had studied the casualty figures from earlier river assaults in Italy and northern France, and the numbers were sobering enough to keep senior officers awake at night. A hasty, badly supported crossing against a defended far bank could cost thousands of men in a single morning. Compounding the problem was the sheer unpredictability of the German defense by this stage of the war. The Wehrmacht that faced the Allies in March 1945 was not the disciplined, doctrinally uniform force of 1940. It was a patchwork of shattered divisions, hastily conscripted Volkssturm units, and pockets of fanatical resistance, all mixed with genuinely capable formations that had been pulled back to defend the Reich's last natural barrier. No single intelligence estimate could be trusted for long, because the picture changed by the day, sometimes by the hour, as units were shuffled and reshuffled in a desperate attempt to plug gaps. Commanders needed something better than captured documents and prisoner interrogations, useful as those were. They needed eyes that could see the entire length of the river at once, and they needed those eyes to report back before the situation on the ground had already changed again. Traditional reconnaissance methods, the kind that had served armies for a century, simply could not keep pace with a battle moving this quickly. Cavalry scouts on the ground could see perhaps a few kilometers of front on a good day, and they paid for that information in blood when they ran into German rearguards dug in behind hedgerows and rubble. Aerial reconnaissance using converted bombers was faster, but far too vulnerable over a heavily defended target like the Rhine, where German anti-aircraft batteries had been concentrated precisely because everyone knew a crossing was coming. There was also the matter of scale. The Rhine, from the Swiss border to the Dutch frontier, ran for well over 1,000 kilometers, and while only a fraction of that length was ever seriously considered as a crossing point, even the short list of viable sectors stretched across dozens of towns, each with its own bridges, ferries, and fords, each needing to be watched, rewatched, and watched again as German engineers worked through the nights preparing their demolitions. Adding to the difficulty was the question of timing. Intelligence that was accurate on a Monday might be worthless by Thursday. German commanders, however depleted their forces, retained a stubborn talent for redeploying units at short notice, moving artillery batteries between sectors under cover of darkness, or reinforcing a threatened crossing point with whatever reserves could still be scraped together. A reconnaissance photograph taken a fortnight before an attack was, by the time infantry actually moved, close to useless, and in some documented cases had actively misled planners who trusted stale imagery over fresher, if less complete, reports. What the Allied armies required, then, was not simply a way of photographing vast stretches of enemy-held territory at high resolution. They needed to do it repeatedly, at high speed, and survive to bring the film home often enough that commanders could trust the picture in front of them was still true. It sounds almost simple, stated like that. Achieving it was one of the quieter technical triumphs of the entire European campaign, and it rested on an unlikely aircraft that had begun life as a fighter and been reborn, stripped of its guns, as one of the most important tools of the war. The answer came out of a fighter that nobody had originally designed for the job. The Lockheed P-38 Lightning, with its distinctive twin-boom fuselage, had earned a reputation in the Pacific and in North Africa as a formidable interceptor. But by 1943, the United States Army Air Forces had recognized something else in its airframe. Strip out the cannon and machine guns from the nose, replace them with a cluster of specialist cameras, and you had an aircraft that could outrun most of what the Luftwaffe could still put into the air, fly at altitudes above 12,000 meters where flak became far less accurate, and carry enough film to map hundreds of square kilometers in a single sortie. Designated the F-5, this photographic version of the Lightning became the backbone of tactical reconnaissance for the United States Army in Europe, flown by squadrons such as those of the 10th Photographic Reconnaissance Group, based at airfields scattered across newly liberated France and Belgium. The cameras themselves were marvels of applied engineering, built by firms like Fairchild, mounted in trios within the aircraft's nose so that a single pass could capture overlapping images from 3 angles simultaneously. This overlap mattered enormously because it allowed photo interpreters on the ground to view the resulting prints through a stereoscope, a simple viewing device not unlike a child's toy, and see the terrain in 3 dimensions. A flat, black-and-white photograph might miss a low bunker or a camouflaged gun pit. Viewed in stereo, the same photograph revealed shadow and depth, and a trained interpreter could pick out an entrenchment from the subtle way it disturbed the surrounding earth. The scale of the operation was considerable. A single reconnaissance wing might expose tens of thousands of individual photographic frames in the weeks leading up to a major river crossing, and processing that volume of film required entire mobile laboratories, essentially portable darkrooms built into lorries and tents, staffed around the clock by technicians developing negatives almost as fast as the aircraft could land. What made this system so effective was not simply the quality of the cameras, but the speed of the whole chain, from exposure to finished intelligence product. A pilot might take off before dawn, fly a photographic run along a stretch of the Rhine, land within the hour, and have his film in the hands of interpreters before lunch. Those interpreters, working in requisitioned buildings often within a few kilometers of the front, would compare the new photographs against previous sorties, flagging any change. A newly dug trench line, a bridge that had gained an extra span of demolition wiring overnight, a column of vehicles that had not been there the day before. This comparative method, looking not just at what the enemy had but at what had changed since the last photograph, gave Allied commanders something close to a living picture of the German defensive line, updated almost daily along critical stretches of the river. The work was far from safe. Reconnaissance pilots flew alone, unarmed and entirely reliant on altitude and speed to survive, and German fighter controllers learned to recognize the distinctive silhouette of an approaching F-5 as a priority target, since a single successful interception could blind an entire sector of the front for days. Loss rates among photographic reconnaissance squadrons through the winter of 1944 and into 1945 were not trivial, and every pilot who failed to return took with him whatever unprocessed intelligence sat undeveloped in his cameras. ground crews waiting at the airstrip for returning aircraft learned to read the sound of an approaching engine, listening for the telltale unevenness of battle damage long before the plane came into view. And there are accounts from mechanics and armorers of a particular dreaded stillness that settled over a dispersal field when a sortie failed to return on schedule. It was this steady rhythm of aerial photography, cross-checked constantly against ground reconnaissance from armored cavalry units probing forward in jeeps and light tanks, that shaped the operational picture General Omar Bradley and his subordinate commanders relied upon as they approached the Rhine in early March. Photographs of the Remagen sector had shown the Ludendorff bridge still standing, still apparently intact in the days immediately before the 9th Armored Division's reconnaissance elements reached the town. That single piece of continuously updated intelligence, rather than a lucky accident stumbled upon by chance, was what allowed Combat Command B to move on the bridge with the speed and confidence it did once Timmermann's men reported it still in place. Exact production figures for how many individual reconnaissance sorties fed into the Remagen picture in the final days before the crossing are not fully documented in the surviving open record, and some mission logs from this period were lost or never fully collated, but squadron histories and after-action reports from the units involved make clear that coverage of the sector had been maintained almost continuously through the preceding week. Similarly, further south, reconnaissance flights over the stretch of river near Oppenheim fed directly into General George Patton's decision to force a crossing there on the night of March 22nd, a crossing he was famously eager to complete before Field Marshal Montgomery's much larger, more heavily publicized set-piece assault further north. Soldiers of the 5th Infantry Division who crossed near Oppenheim that night later described the far bank as eerily quiet, with German resistance thin enough that some assault boats reached the eastern shore before drawing any fire at all. A stillness that ground commanders attributed directly to the accuracy of the intelligence picture they had been working from in the days beforehand. Further north, along the stretch of river assigned to Operation Plunder, German prisoners taken in the opening hours of the assault reported confusion about where the main effort would actually fall, a confusion that Allied intelligence officers had worked hard, through both reconnaissance and deliberate deception, to sustain for as long as possible. If you are finding this interesting, a quick subscribe helps more than you know. The German military maintained its own aerial reconnaissance effort throughout this period, but by 1945 it operated under conditions that made sustained, systematic coverage of the front almost impossible. Fuel shortages had become so severe that entire Luftwaffe reconnaissance units sat grounded for days at a time, their aircraft technically airworthy but with no petrol to fly them. What sorties German pilots did manage tended to be flown by aircraft such as the Arado AR-234, a genuinely advanced jet-powered reconnaissance platform that could, in theory, outrun anything the Allies could put into the air. In practice, so few of these aircraft existed, and fuel was so scarce that they could offer nothing like the continuous, dense coverage that American photo-reconnaissance wings were achieving along the Rhine. The contrast was stark. American squadrons could photograph the same stretch of river repeatedly across a single week, building a picture of change over time. German commanders were often working from information that was days or even weeks out of date by the time it reached the units that needed it. British reconnaissance efforts, by comparison, were formidable in their own right and closely coordinated with the American system, particularly through shared photographic intelligence centers, but the specific combination of the F-5 Lightning's range and altitude with the sheer industrial scale of American film processing gave the United States Army a volume of coverage that its allies frequently drew upon directly. Operation Plunder, Montgomery's set-piece Rhine crossing north of the Ruhr in late March, benefited enormously from photographic intelligence gathered by both British and American reconnaissance wings working in tandem. But it was the flexibility of American squadrons, able to redirect sorties at short notice to cover Patton's fast-moving advance further south, that allowed two dramatically different styles of crossing, one meticulously planned and set for a fixed date, the other seized almost on impulse, to succeed within days of one another. The material impact of this reconnaissance effort is, by its nature, difficult to reduce to a single tidy statistic. Historians broadly agree that the intelligence picture built from aerial photography and ground reconnaissance in the weeks before the Rhine crossings significantly reduced Allied casualties, by allowing commanders to choose crossing points where German defenses were demonstrably weaker or less alert, rather than attacking blind against whatever happened to lie opposite the nearest riverbank. The psychological effect on German commanders was, if anything, more corrosive still. Reports from German officers captured in the closing weeks of the war describe a growing sense that Allied forces seemed to know their dispositions almost as soon as they were established, an unnerving feeling of transparency that sapped confidence in the ability to spring any genuine surprise. Whether that perception was always accurate is impossible to verify from the surviving record, and some claims made after the war by both sides carry the natural exaggeration of hindsight. What can be said with confidence is that the pace of change on the German side of the river consistently outstripped the ability of German commanders to communicate it upward through their own chain of command, while on the American side, the reconnaissance chain from cockpit to commander's desk had been compressed to a matter of hours. The techniques pioneered by photographic reconnaissance squadrons over the Rhine did not disappear with the end of the war. The stereoscopic interpretation methods refined by Allied photo intelligence units became a standard practice for military and, later, intelligence agencies through the Cold War, feeding directly into the high-altitude reconnaissance programs that would eventually produce aircraft like the U-2. Surviving F-5 Lightnings, a handful preserved in museum collections in the United States and occasionally seen at air shows, offer a physical link back to a role that left almost no dramatic wreckage or famous set-piece battle of its own, precisely because reconnaissance aircraft succeeded when nothing happened to them at all. Some of the actual photographic prints and mission reports from the Remagen and Oppenheim sectors survive today in American and German archives, unglamorous strips of grainy black and white film that nonetheless carry within them the shape of decisions that changed the course of the campaign. Return for a moment to that ridge above Remagen on the morning of March 7th. Lieutenant Timmermann and his men did not stumble onto an intact bridge through blind fortune. They arrived there because a chain of quiet, dangerous, unglamorous work had told their commanders with reasonable confidence that the bridge was worth reaching quickly. A pilot who flew low and fast over flak-heavy skies with no gun to defend himself. A technician developing film through the night in a freezing tent so that the picture would be ready by morning. An interpreter squinting through a stereoscope, comparing today's photograph against yesterday's, looking for the one small change that mattered. None of them fired a shot in the battle that followed. None of them appear in the famous photographs of American soldiers crossing the captured bridge under fire, or in the newsreel footage that flashed the news of the crossing around the world within days. But the men who did cross that bridge and the tens of thousands who followed them into Germany in the weeks after owed a debt to that unseen chain of observation that is easy to overlook precisely because it did its job so well. War is often remembered through its loudest moments, the explosions, the charges, the collapse of bridges, and the roar of tank engines. The battle for the Rhine was won, in no small part, through its quietest ones. A camera shutter clicking at altitude, a film reel unspooling in the dark, a grease pencil marking a change on a map that had not been there the day before. These were the tools that redrew the battle for the Rhine, not by force, but by seeing clearly what others could only guess at. In the end, that clarity was worth more than any single weapon fielded in the closing months of the war in Europe. The bridge at Remagen fell into American hands not because of luck, but because for months beforehand, unarmed men in unarmed aircraft had refused to stop looking. That is the story the history books rarely tell in full, and it is, in its own understated way, one of the most consequential of the entire war.